This is a momentous occasion. It marks a pivotal event in Jewish history, in British history, and world history.
Today marks the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration.
This is the desk where the Balfour Declaration was composed.
A British pledge that many feel paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel.
The 100 years of Balfour Declaration is something that's unacceptable to us. It's a disaster and a tragedy for Palestinians and Israelis.
The real tragedy of the Balfour Declaration is that it took 3 decades to fulfill its promise.
Before we get into the implications of the Declaration, or even the point of this documentary really, I want to contextualize what it is. The Balfour Declaration was created in 1917 by Arthur James Balfour, the then Prime Minister of Britain. It called for a Jewish country in what is now Israel-Palestine.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people.
Balfour wanted this nation to be in a section of the Ottoman Empire, which Britain was preparing to take control of after World War I. But this land was not an empty one. It was home to over 600,000 Arabs, so the Declaration attempted to address this.
It being clearly understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
And that's the entire declaration, just these 67 words. And yet I believe that this little blurb of text ended up becoming the most important piece in the creation of Israel. Without it, there would be no legislative backing, violent riots, and international support that Israel has today. But this all begs the question, why was it Britain that made this declaration? When the Declaration was created, it was just under a year until World War I was going to end. When it was clear the Ottomans were about to lose, Britain started making deals with others of what they were going to do with the land, the Balfour Declaration being one of them. That brings us to 1918, where Britain officially takes over Palestine, beginning the British Mandate, which is just what they called Israel-Palestine when Britain had control. But why was Balfour so adamant on making a Jewish state on that land? Well, he explains it best in an introduction for a book he wrote called The History of Zionism. The only qualification I possess is that I've always been greatly interested in the Jewish question. When anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe was in an acute stage, conversations I held with Dr. Weizmann convinced me that history could not thus be ignored, and that if a home was to be found for the Jewish people, it was vain to seek it anywhere but in Palestine. Balfour, seeing rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and Britain's recent control of Jerusalem, thought he'd be doing good of the Jewish people if he gave them the Holy Land to create a nation around. Side note, Dr. Weizmann, whom Balfour mentioned in the passage, was the president of the Zionist organization and later became the first president of Israel. He'll be important later. It was also speculated that another reason Balfour turned to the Jews was so they'd give him support in World War I. He was afraid of Jews siding with the Ottoman Empire, and so he wanted to do something that would be good for the Jewish people so they would help him out throughout the war. While there had been riots denouncing the Balfour Declaration, Britain was the world superpower, had just won the Great World War, and had full control of Palestine, meaning no government nor organization that denounced the Declaration could do anything about it. In other words, Britain could do whatever it wanted. It had full responsibility of dealing with the land and its people. So after 3 years of mass immigration to the British Mandate, Britain released its first report on the land. Here's some snippets of that report. 4/5 of the whole population are Muslims. The long delay in the formal settlement of the international status of Palestine has tended to disturb the minds of the people. Between September 1920 and May 1921, about 10,000 immigrants arrived. On May 1st, there was a riot in Jaffa. Disturbances continued during the following days. Attacks were made from Arab villages upon the Jewish colonies of Petah Tikva and Childea. And keep in mind, this is all filtered through the British government, who wants to make the settlement look as good as possible. Needless to say, Britain was doing a bad job of upholding its responsibility of running the land. Probably the biggest oversight of the Balfour Declaration is the native Arabs. Even though they said that nothing shall be done to their religious or civil rights, you can see the situation today, and it's not how Balfour imagined. As I mentioned earlier, there was some retaliation of the Arabs, but it wasn't only violent. Throughout the 20s, there were several attempts to solve this diplomatically, but nothing was working. And so eventually, in 1929, there were the Jerusalem riots. Now, the footage from those riots are grainy at best, but it shows just how big this event was. By the end, 133 Jews and 116 Arabs were killed. But it wasn't just the violence itself that was leading to the creation of Israel. It's the fact that these two groups couldn't get along, and it's all because of that darn declaration. You can imagine a world where Balfour spent more time outlining how Jewish immigration would be limited, or spent a few more sentences talking about the rights of the natives, but he didn't. And that's how we got to the situation we're in today, where the native Arabs have much less rights than the incoming Jews. Interestingly enough, the British government did not intervene with the 1929 riots. It was up to the government officials in the British Mandate to fix all of that, but that wouldn't be the case almost a decade later when the Arab Revolt broke out in 1936. This revolt put militaries behind the conflict, further separating Arabs and Jews, even those who disapproved of the conflict. Now, the revolt promptly ended in 1939 due to the German fellow in Europe, but during those 3 years of fighting, the British government created a partition plan to divide the land into two countries, and it wouldn't be the only country to try. Before getting into the several partition plans thrown around in the 30s and 40s, let's quickly jump back to World War I. Britain was making rapid-fire decisions in their cabinet, but almost nothing could be passed without the insight of US President Woodrow Wilson, who was in great favor of a Jewish state in the Middle East, partially convinced by the Balfour Declaration. It was only because the UK and US won the Great World War that the League of Nations officiated the British Mandate in 1920 in the first place. Alright, now onto the partition plans. Back in the late 30s, when the Arab Revolt was in full force, Britain sent down the Peel Commission to investigate the situation and see if they can come up with a solution. And here's what they said in their own report. The mandate in its existing form is unworkable, and Palestine should be partitioned into a distinct Jewish and Arab entity. This is what the map looked like, with yellow being the Arab nation, green being the Jewish nation, and red being controlled by Britain. However, the Arabs hated that the Jews got most of the fertile parts of the land, and the Jews were okay with having a percentage of the land relative to their population, but wanted to expand it as they wanted to grow their community. This one was a no-go. Throughout the next 10 years, several partition plans were brought into light, but the whole mandate was on shaky grounds because of this piece of paper and World War II. In short, this paper was Britain folding to some Arab requests, stating that some form of independent Palestine must exist a decade from then, and heavily limiting Jewish immigration to 75,000 more Jews until 1944. Unfortunately, just 4 months after this paper was put into law, Nazi Germany began one of the largest genocides on the Jewish people ever. So that's a bit of a predicament. And by the time World War II ended, Britain was tired. It was low on resources, having just come from a 5-year World War, and had no interest in upkeeping the British Mandate. So they went to the newly founded United Nations and told them they were officially withdrawing their responsibility of the land on May 15th, 1948. That gave the UN just 1 year to create a partition plan that everyone could agree on, and by November of that year, they came up with this map. The Arabs once again disagreed, rightfully stating that the Jews were just 1/3 of the population, and yet were being given over half the land. However, in a UN vote of 33 to 13, the resolution was passed. Britain would officially withdraw from the conflict that they started, giving up all responsibility of the land. And I wish I could tell you that Jews and Arabs have since figured it out, and that everyone has basic human rights, let alone equal rights. But that's simply not the case. As I'm speaking, there's an active war happening right now in the region with no signs of stopping. So back to 1948, the Arabs of course disagreed with this partition plan, but it was already set in stone. So on May 14th, 1948, Jewish troops came to claim their territory, and thus started the creation of Israel. And it all started from these 67 words.